Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. And yes, today we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russia-Ukrainian war. So first, as we look at this map, it is the deep state map. I believe, and this is just my opinion, that obviously this is a Ukrainian supporter generated map. Now, however, with that being said, I think this map would get more validity if it changed what we were seeing, and specifically these goofy pig symbols that are being used to identify Russian forces. I think the map would get more validity if it changed those to maybe proper NATO symbology. But for whatever reason, they've decided to utilize the pig symbols for Russian forces. And if you look here, and again, it's very difficult to say how accurate this information is. Again, this is the 141st Separate Guards Tank Battalion and the 429th Motorized Rifle Regiment, components of the 19th Motorized Rifle Division or the 42nd Motorized Rifle Division that are operating in this area near Zaporizhia, the Enderhar nuclear power plant. But as we look at the map, and as we look what is happening on the ground within the scope of this conflict, we've talked about the prospects of a new Ukrainian push, quite possibly in the direction of Mariupol or Melitopol, this area here, designed to cut the land bridge to Crimea, again, from the eastern Donbass to Crimea. So is that likely? Is it likely that we are going to see a new Ukrainian offensive operation against Russian forces directed towards Melitopol? Difficult to say. I am leaning towards, at this point, a no. And the reason I'm leaning towards a no in terms of at least a successful Ukrainian offensive is the amount of casualties that the Ukrainians have taken within the last several weeks. Compounding that, the Russian force density in this area is increasing. The Ukrainians took quite a bit of casualties in those ongoing operations directed at the Russian western bank of Kherson. As we look at interviews that are currently taking place, be it the BBC, Washington Post, Washington Compost, poll reporters, what have you, it is very, very apparent from those reports, especially when we look at the age of some of the Ukrainian soldiers that are being interviewed, that the Ukrainian army appears to be getting older. So why is it getting older? Usually when you look at armies, properly trained, properly equipped fighting units, prior to war taking place, generally speaking, outside of the NCO Corps, non-commissioned officers, but even then, they're in that 18, 19 to 22, 23 age bracket. And again, this is just what I am seeing. This may be different. It could be off base. It's possible. But what I'm seeing, again, in a lot of these interviews, many of these Ukrainian soldiers, again, privates on the front line, 36, 46 years of age. They're getting older. Now, we've heard reports coming out of Ukraine about their casualty rates. We've heard 100,000 casualties. In all probability, those are both KIA'd and wounded. We've heard, again, the newest reports coming out of Ukrainian leadership in Kiev of 13,000 KIA'd. But look, that's very similar to the amount that was reported months ago. 10 to 15,000. So obviously, what the Ukrainians are reporting is much, much different than the realities on the ground. And then you look at, again, the age of some of these frontline Ukrainian soldiers. They're getting older. Now, are we seeing that on the Russian side as well? To a certain extent, yes. But I would say when we look at video reports, we look at interviews coming from the Russian side, their soldiers appear to be younger. But again, take it at face value, take it for what it's worth. State that you don't believe that. That's fine. I get it. And I understand why, depending on where you sit, on which side you are taking in this conflict. But again, just a kind of a bird's eye view on what we are seeing here at MFAN. In other news, well, let me go back to the prospect of this Ukrainian offensive operation directed towards Melitopol. So again, we keep hearing maybe December, January, when the ground freezes. It's interesting. Didn't we hear that before? But kind of on the flip side with the Russians. Now, again, I think the Ukrainians are probably at this point in a position where they have to launch some sort of operation, be it successful or not. They are probably going to do something directed south from Zaporizhia. But again, the possibility of it being successful, given the force density we are seeing by the Russians, the digging in of Russian forces, in all probability, it's not going to be successful. And I've talked about this before, that if for some reason we do see a successful Ukrainian offensive operation that does seize control of Melitopol, that does see the splitting of the land bridge from Donbass to the Crimea, then yes, I would say at that point, if that does happen, and that's a big if, and I don't think it is going to happen from what we're seeing on the ground right now. But if, big if it does, then the likelihood that the Ukrainians win this conflict becomes incredibly high. But where we're sitting right now, I don't believe that is going to happen. And other updates. The Russians are reporting that they have conducted software updates, firmware updates of their air defense systems, namely S-300s, S-400s, possibly other systems, that have the ability to identify the HIMARS rocket in flight. Now look, the Ukrainians are using about 36 systems, both tracked, wheeled, that have the capability of firing the M30, M31 precision-guided rocket that the HIMARS use, with a range of 70-plus kilometers. Is it possible that the Russians now have the ability to shoot these systems down? Yeah, it is. Absolutely. Is it going to make much of a difference in what we're seeing on the ground? I don't think so. I think, and I believe, that first the Russians are going to have to improve their ability to locate and destroy these HIMARS systems on the ground. Destroy their depots where many of these munitions that are used in the firing of the HIMARS are positioned. If they destroy the rockets, and there is not an indefinite supply of these, These are produced by Lockheed Martin, and they are very complex systems. Well, I don't want to say they're not brimstones. They're not brimstone twos, but the supply is not bottomless, obviously. And if the Russians are able to do that, locate, destroy those supply depots, that changes things. And again, the HIMARS component of this war, in conjunction with the intelligence that is being supplied by, yes, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in the United States, is having a great impact on this conflict. Clearly. But we will see if this software firmware update does anything for the Russians in terms of preventing some of these very precise and very devastating rocket attacks that have taken place. I think many years into the future, when we finally get a good idea of what happened on the ground, because again, a lot of what is happening is being obstructed. We can't exactly tell you, the viewer, what is happening on the ground out of secrecy of ongoing operations. But we do know with absolute certainty the HIMARS is taking a toll on Russian forces, and a variety of Russian forces, given its range. And again, compound it with real-time intelligence. So again, I would say at this point, a successful Ukrainian operation designed to split that land corridor, I would say at this point, is fairly remote, given the amount of Russian forces that are now being deployed. And then we have to look into the future. Again, I believe summer, late summer, is when we will probably start to see renewed Russian operations against other areas besides Bakhmut and Avdiivka. I think at this point, in all probability, Avdiivka is in jeopardy of being enveloped. We continue to see fairly successful operations by the Russians, both north and south of Avdiivka, and at the same time, we are continuing to see Russian forces make inroads towards Bakhmut. And at the same time, again, reports are surfacing of just how devastating the Russian artillery is as it's being deployed in the eastern Donbass. Massive amounts of Russian artillery are being used against Ukrainian forces. We are probably not getting the full picture of just how, we constantly hear about how low the Russian morale is, but in all probability, Ukrainian morale is also starting to wane in this conflict. So what else is going on? Is the United States starting to tire in terms of handing over large amounts of money and equipment to the Ukrainians? Could the political situation inside the United States start to change what is happening on the ground? As an American, I question writing the Ukrainians a blank check. I question handing over to the Ukrainians some of our most advanced weapon systems. Look, if the Chinese get their hands on an intact Brimstone 2, and look, Brimstone 2 is at the pinnacle of our technology tree. It is an incredible weapon system. Now look, I get that it is not an American weapon system, but a British weapon system, but nonetheless, some of the same technology that is on that Brimstone 2, is also on the American Hellfire. More advanced versions of the Hellfire. But again, that Brimstone 2, if captured intact by the Russians and handed over to the Chinese, you would probably see a system very similar that would be rapidly produced by the Chinese. And we're starting to see that now. We're starting to see, obviously, the Russian military-industrial complex start to analyze and start to either produce and or modify existing systems based on the experience of the current conflict. That kind of brings up another issue, the idea that Russia is running out of equipment. I believe that's a farce. I think and I believe that as we speak, the Russian military-industrial complex is probably mobilizing on a war footing quicker than the actual Russian military. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that on the ground. We're seeing that in updates on the tanks. We're seeing the Russian forces being re-equipped, units, reserve units being re-equipped, reconstituted with new tanks. Or tanks that have been taken out of reserve and then updated with modern capabilities. And I have no doubt whatsoever that the Chinese are assisting the Russians in those endeavors. Way under the radar, but in all probability, it is absolutely happening. So the idea that the Russians are just going to run out of equipment because of Western sanctions, again, not going to happen. I anticipate that we will probably see a new Russian series of Russian missile strikes designed to take down Ukrainian infrastructure, power, heat, water, what have you. And this serves, again, multiple functions by the Russian military. Degrade the Ukrainian will to fight, but at the same time, this also has a military impact as well. So we will continue to monitor, we will continue to report on what is happening on the ground. It does look like, at least right now, that both sides are suffering war fatigue, both militaries. It was very interesting, and before I close down for this video, there was a document released by the Russians that talked about how the Russians planned for this operation, what the Russian war goals, war aims were. And yes, the Russians were focused on seizing control of Kiev. Kiev was not a diversionary operation. But what keeps raising its ugly head, at least as far as I'm concerned, outside the scope of the lack of performance of the Russian Air Force, which, in my opinion, has probably caused what we're seeing happen right now in terms of lack of Russian success. But more importantly, well, maybe not more importantly, but equally, is these continued reports that Russian line units, Russian battalion tactical groups, maybe not Spetsnaz, the special purpose groups, maybe not certain formations of the VDV of Russian airborne or marine forces, the more elite forces of the Russian army, but these line battalion tactical groups, units like the 2nd and 4th Division based near Moscow. It's very important. It's very, very important to note that we continue to see these units state that they had no idea they were invading Ukraine, that they were going to conduct military operations inside of Ukraine. And at the very, very least, or at the very worst, these forces were saying they anticipated very low levels of engagement, very low intensity warfare occurring. I can tell you, the viewer, when the United States invaded Iraq, both Gulf War I, Gulf War II, but especially Gulf War I, having firsthand knowledge of that, we very much knew we were invading Iraq. Not only that, we believed going into Gulf War I, that the Iraqi army was highly proficient. We were concerned that we were going to take heavy casualties against Iraqi forces. So therefore, we trained in a manner that gave us this upper hand, thinking that we were going up against a much more robust, significant, and dedicated force. Within the confines of this conflict, the Russia-Ukrainian conflict, we are not hearing that. We are hearing that Russian line units did not believe the Ukrainians were going to fight in some cases. That's disturbing. And that's probably what has led to the current situation we're seeing on the ground now. Now, obviously, that has changed. And in all probability, with the continued mobilization efforts by the Russian military, an experience gained by Russian forces at the front line, understanding the type of force that they are now fighting, the dedication at which the Ukrainian forces, the level of dedication they are fighting, is probably changing the facts on the ground for the Russians. Now they are probably preparing for an aggressive, motivated enemy. But will that turn itself into a change on the battlefield in terms of what we've seen? Difficult to say at this point. But again, the idea that Russian forces entered Ukraine thinking that they were not going to see very much action, or didn't even know that they were entering Ukraine with the intent of engaging the Ukrainian military, that is not a good sign. It's probably led to what we're seeing right now. But that's all we have for today. Thank you for joining us. We will have more to come very, very soon. And as always, have a good day.